Hey, how's it going? I'm Nick, the host of the Ekho Academy podcast, a podcast where we tap into the world's collective wisdom and experience to learn how we can be more resilient. In today's episode, I speak with Jolene Hwee, a registered psychologist and founder of Clarity Counselling and Consulting. Our conversation revolves around the topic of trauma, both in ourselves and in the people around us. This topic is particularly important in 2020. With the explosion of COVID-19, to the recession, to the race riots and the fight for reform in the US, we've seen many examples of potential trauma-inducing experiences. Jolene shares with us what trauma actually is, how to tell if you or someone you care about has it, and what we can do about it. More importantly, using examples of our current climate, Jolene shares with us why it's important, now more than ever, to acknowledge someone's suffering, regardless of whether you believe in it or not. Because ultimately, that first interaction will shape how he or she gets help or recovers. This was truly an educational conversation for me, and I'm positive it will be for you too. So, I hope you enjoy it. So let's get to the heart of today's topic.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's really around dealing with traumatic experiences. I think what's interesting is when I first came to you regarding having this particular interview was really around this COVID-19 situation. But, since we last spoke about this, so many things have happened. I mean, I suppose the natural effect of COVID or the cascading effect of COVID was, the job insecurity. And as a result, millions of jobs have been lost as well. And then after that, we also had the issues that are happening in the US with the murder of George Floyd. And I suppose those generational trauma, especially with regards to race. So I think, in terms of trauma, there's so much that has happened that I suppose is really relatable. So I'm sure it'll be a really interesting conversation. But I suppose before that, what would be good, especially, to have someone of your stature, I suppose, to explain to us what it means to go through a traumatic experience.
Well, I think the simplest way to really kind of describe it, I always kind of go back to one of my favorite authors in the trauma field, and she was basically the first first book I read, as a graduate student. And her name is Judith Herman. And she wrote this book in 1992 called Trauma and Recovery. And in that, she said, I'm going to quote Judith Herman here, traumatic events are extraordinary, not because they occur rarely, but rather because they overwhelm the ordinary human adaptations to life. So traumatic events generally involve threats to life or bodily integrity, or a close personal encounter with violence and death. These events confront human beings with the extremities of helplessness and terror and evoke the responses of catastrophe. So since, the trauma field emerged, essentially around the time of the Vietnam War, that was when, intensive research into trauma was initiated in the US. And out of that research, we finally had what we call now the PTSD diagnosis. So prior to that, PTSD was not recognized as a clinical diagnosis, right? Only after intensive research of the veterans that returned home from the Vietnam War, and then they couldn't actually go back to their normal lives because they had all these traumatic symptoms that were impairing their normal lives, right? And then the experts realized that, hey, we are really dealing with something very different, that's different, completely different from anxiety or depression. And so they kind of really made an effort to understand the phenomenon of PTSD. But since the beginning of the research into the trauma field, we have now realized that, trauma exists on a spectrum, right? And in the trauma field, we always talk about the big T's and the small T's, right? So the big T's are what you and I probably associate with trauma, right? Like war, or like tsunamis and earthquake and floods, or even right now, like exactly you've described, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. That threat of contagion, the threat of a fatal disease is definitely what we call, there's a potential for a big T, right? And then there's the small T as well. The small T is what sometimes we overlook, but most of us have gone through, I'm sure, you've realized this as well, that, life is full of the unexpected. Life is full of crisis and issues and challenges, right? And so we have kind of like small T's as well. Like, for instance, a small T could be a road accident, right? And that happens, unfortunately, quite regularly in life. Or it could be a very unexpected traumatic relationship breakup that can also have a huge impact on our psyche, right? Whether you're breaking up with a romantic partner or we're breaking up with a best friend, that can also be pretty traumatic for some people. And even like the loss of a job. Right now, a lot of people, like you said, are struggling financially, and if it's an unexpected job loss, that could be a small T as well, right? So the idea of, the concept of trauma is not that it is extraordinary, but because they overwhelm us, right? They overwhelm us, and therefore it becomes extraordinary. So traumatic stress reactions are simply normal reactions to abnormal circumstances. Yeah. So
Right.
there's idea that, when someone feels traumatized, they don't have an issue. It's not that there's something wrong with them. I just want to get that right out, be very clear about that, because they are having a very normal emotional response to an abnormal circumstance, right? Just like this COVID-19 crisis. I mean, none of us has, I don't think, expected to live through a pandemic in our lifetime, right?
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I wasn't.
No, me definitely not. No.
Yeah, not predicting that, right? So this is an absolutely abnormal circumstance. Like this, even the circumstances of a lockdown, right? The lockdown itself is extraordinarily abnormal. We are like social creatures. We need to feel connected. We need face-to-face interactions. And now millions of people are being isolated, right? And this is extremely abnormal. So if you are in the middle of a lockdown and a pandemic, and you're feeling irritable or anxious or lethargic or demotivated, I would say that's quite a normal reaction to an abnormal circumstance.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm curious that, so does it, because there, most of us, I would say, would have experienced a small T trauma. Does it matter if we define it as trauma? Is it important for us to identify it as a traumatic experience?
Well, I think this is where the semantics come in place, right? When I was teaching this module, I think it was called Crisis and Trauma in a Tertiary Institution, crisis, trauma, and resilience. These are basically three main concepts that, I took time to really differentiate because they're quite important. So you could think of it as an event starts out as a crisis, right? Whether it's a pandemic or a job loss or a relationship breakup, they're all crises, right? So
Right.
basically they're challenges. But whether they overwhelm you is another thing altogether, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So whether it's overwhelming and you feel like it's intolerable and it exceeds your coping mechanisms, right? That's another thing altogether, right? And
Yeah.
to the extent that it exceeds its coping mechanisms, it's very individual as well, right? So we also have this saying in the trauma field that the same event can happen to two people, but the two people can have very different responses to the same event. No two people will have the same response to the same event, So
Yeah.
that's why, when I think when we talk about trauma, we're very sensitive to very cognizant of the fact that people have very different coping mechanisms, right? So if we're going through the same pandemic or the same earthquake or the same flood, that doesn't mean that all of us have the same traumatic response. Some people will cope extraordinarily well, and I think this is what is very positive from the studies that have shown come up so far in resilience studies, that the statistic now is about 70% of us actually will recover
Right.
from a crisis, right, without long-standing post-traumatic stress symptoms. So we are naturally resilient. We have that innate ability to recover from crisis and challenges without developing PTSD. But there is a percentage of the population, that will develop PTSD, and that percentage of the population needs extra care and extra attention. Yeah.
Right.
Mm.
I really like the analogy, because I suppose it's well, not analogy but phrase, that's because it's easy for us to understand, and that's where it exceeds our coping mechanisms or our ability to
Mm.
cope. So that's a good
Mm-hmm.
reminder.
Yeah.
So does that also mean that, let's say we've experienced that particular trauma, or however else we choose to call it.
Mm.
Let's say that happens and we overcome it. Does that mean our coping mechanisms become stronger generally, or just for that specific instance? I'm just curious. I know this was not
Mm.
there.
No, it's totally fine. Yeah. So I think, for instance, let's take relationships, because I feel like relationships are one of the things that are under constant threat and stress in this pandemic, right? In
Yeah.
lockdown, either you're kind of what I call in enforced closeness with your family members, and that could go either way, right? Or you're
Yeah.
you're in enforced isolation when you're separated from your boyfriend or your fiance, and that could also go either way, right? I mean,
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. So relationships are really under a lot of pressure in this time of pandemic. So let's use a relational example, right? So if you've gone through a relationship breakup, pretty common experience, right, for an adult, right?
Right.
Yeah, we've all gone through our share of breakups, and we've all maybe responded to them quite differently in terms of our personality or coping mechanisms or our upbringing or our values or etc. So I think we will cope. How we cope with the first breakup is probably how we will cope with the second and the third, until that coping strategy no longer works,
Right.
right? Yeah. So, for instance, if you've had a first relationship breakup and you coped with it by, I don't know, can you give me an example, Nicholas? How do men generally cope with breakups nowadays?
Or how about
Oh,
this? I can use myself as an example, and I
okay,
can
yeah, go ahead.
and I can also tell you how it changed me. So
Yeah.
my very first relationship, after we broke up, I mean, or at least during the difficult moments, I became insanely jealous,
Mm,
of like how other men or other suitors were trying to get with my at
mm,
that time soon to be ex-girlfriend, right?
mm,
and
mm,
and so I suppose jealousy, because I just couldn't handle that kind of uh, because it was all rocky, like jealousy became that one thing that kept coming up. But as a result of that, what I found really interesting was that in future relationships, I think that almost that the jealous tendency was almost eliminated. As such, I'm not jealous of anything or anyone anymore. So I don't know
mm,
if that's something like that's a coping mechanism where I just choose to suppress or whether it's a subconscious
Mm,
thing. But what's
yeah.
interesting is like I'm neither jealous of people's success or if someone is trying to attract my partner, for example, that jealousy mechanism has almost disappeared. So maybe that I don't know if that's a good example.
So you mean that you don't get jealous right now, even like in the present moment?
Yeah, and that's
Mm,
something interesting. It feels abnormal, but I suppose I wouldn't have it any other way because that part of me was so ugly, and I didn't like myself
mm,
during that
right.
period. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So it sounds like, that coping strategy of jealousy was too costly, right? Or you saw the cost of that strategy. And this is what happens for most of us, right? When our coping strategies no longer work for us or the cost exceeds the benefit of the strategy,
yep.
you know? So when cost exceeds the benefit, we have to find another way of coping. So it sounded like you found another way of coping, whether it was logic or detachment, whatever that was, that helped you to let go of the jealousy and find another way of coping, you know?
Right.
So,
Okay.
yeah, so we will always cope the way that we have coped in the past, unless that coping strategy, like I said, no longer works or costs too much, you know. Yeah, so for instance, a lot of people cope by, for instance, maybe alcohol dependence, right? So
Yep.
it could be that alcohol dependence worked in the past, so we do it again to cope with stress or isolation. But then for some people, the dependency becomes too much and too costly, right? Maybe it affects their work or their health or their sleep. And then they realize, oh, actually, this doesn't, this is not really sustainable, right?
Yeah.
So then you have to find something else. So you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting that you bring that up because um now that you mention it, I suppose how we deal with one uh and
Mm,
I'm thinking of the alcohol example, like let's say we deal
mm,
with a bad relationship by res- turning to alcoholism.
mm,
um, it almost seems like because let's say if it numbs our pain and our sorrows, I'm sure it has like effects for any future problem we might have, regardless of whether it's a breakup or not, right? Where so let's say if we are retrenched or if we
yeah.
witness a death in the family, we're like, okay, alcoholism because it numbed my pain before. Is that
Right.
true?
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. So not just so how we cope with one breakup could be the same coping strategy. Not one breakup, one crisis, one
Yeah.
challenge could be the same way of coping with other challenges and crises because we are, creatures of habit, right? I mean, essentially, human beings. We just repeat what we know until it doesn't work anymore. So absolutely right. So I think of alcohol dependency is kind of like one of the you know kind of items under this whole category of avoidance strategies, so if you are in the habit of avoiding problems, there are many ways to avoid a problem, as you know, not just by alcohol, but just to even just not acknowledge it exists, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, not to talk about it. So if you are a kind of a avoidant kind of type personality, then you might have a whole host of avoidant strategies, right? You might avoid people, you might stay silent for too long, you might have excessive substance abuse or substance use, um, and that's how you cope with challenges or crises, whether it's a relational one or a job one or a financial one. Yeah, so that would be kind of your go-to kind of coping template until it doesn't work anymore, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny that you brought up the point of avoidance because I think especially in the issue of race relations in the U.S. now,
Mm-hmm.
right? Many people have have as a coping mechanism have sought to avoidance, and now all of a sudden, there's this like incredible
Mm-hmm.
pressure for them to deal with
Mm-hmm.
the situation head on, which in my personal opinion is a bit unfair because, especially if someone is used to avoiding the problem because, maybe they don't have the
Mm-hmm.
adequate coping mechanisms to deal with that
Mm-hmm.
experience. And now everyone's like, oh, if you're silent, then you're just supporting
Mm-hmm.
racism. I think in my opinion, that's incredibly unfair, but I don't know what is it fair to be asking people to change the way they deal with these kind
Mm-hmm.
of experiences?
I don't know if I would want to kind of say yes or no to that question, but I do want to first acknowledge that, I think what we're seeing really in the US is the unfortunate collision of two pandemics, right? I think most people have really recognized that the COVID-19 pandemic and the racism pandemic, they are not unrelated.
Right.
So we are seeing the huge kind of collision of these two viruses, right? Into one. It's a combustion because because I think racism, systemic racism has been a long, deep-seated issue in the US that has not been addressed for decades, if not centuries, right?
Yeah.
And I think with COVID-19, with the inequalities in the healthcare system, I think this has been all brought to light. And when I look at the live streams or the videos online, there's no denying, right, that what we're seeing is an outpouring of collective trauma and grief.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
when we look at the streets of people who are angry and grieving, that's what collective trauma looks like. And remember again what I said in the beginning of our chat, that when we respond to trauma, the response isn't abnormal. That's not the abnormal thing, right?
Yes.
It's a normal reaction to an abnormal circumstance. So this rage and grief and demand for justice is actually a normal response to deep systemic racism that has not been addressed,
I
that has
agree.
not been heard, right? So I mean, I mean, it's a very unfortunate thing to witness. I was even just witnessing it online was very emotionally impactful for me, because I studied in the States, and I have friends in the States that are very affected by what is happening. And I think before we can say what is right or what is wrong, I think we first have to acknowledge the pain and the grief and the anger that does exist, right? Because the thing
Absolutely.
about trauma is that it cannot be healed without being acknowledged, you
Absolutely.
know. Yeah, so we can't heal the trauma, the collective trauma of generations of Black Americans without taking time to really listen and understand and acknowledge the hurt and the pain. um, and really, I don't know how long that will take, but I think we need to hold space for them. I'm not condoning, obviously, I'm not condoning violence or looting or anything like that. But I think the large majority of the protesters have something valid to say. Um, and so I think that's why it's been, resonating across the world as well, right? I'm sure you've seen it resonated in, I heard, even Europe and even Japan. There's been protests on the streets against racism because, it's something that if you've been ever subjected to racism in your life, you know how much it hurts, right? You know how much
Yes.
it can be deeply traumatic. Yeah, it can be deeply it's basically it's bullying. It's bullying, right? To the
Yeah.
fullest extent. Yeah, and any victim of bullying knows how traumatic it can feel, right? And that event stays with you for so long. Whether it's a and some of the, I think, this acts of discrimination. The problem with acts of discrimination. And I speak, from my experience of being a minority race in the U.S. for about four years as well, that the
Yeah.
acts of discrimination sometimes is so insidious, right?
Yeah.
In psychology, we call them microaggressions. So you don't know what happened. Like, you're like, oh, did that just happen? Did that just happen to me? And and then obviously there's always this question like, was it my fault, right? I
Yeah.
don't know if did I do something to deserve that? Is it my fault? Should I have, been more polite? Should I, So I think that's why trauma is needs to be heard and acknowledged first before any recovery can happen, right?
Yeah.
We need to really say, yes, that happened and that's wrong, right? Whether it's trauma from racism or trauma from sexual assault, which unfortunately we've been seeing a rise in cases, right, in Singapore as well.
Yeah.
It's about saying, it's really acknowledging the event, and really hearing it from the victim's perspective and validating his or her experience, right? And saying, yes, that was horrible, and I'm sorry that you have to go through that. That's part of the healing process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I must say that was probably the most relatable thing that I've heard. And to be honest, as in, it's funny because even though as a minority race in Singapore, I've experienced racism. It isn't as much, or it wasn't as significant as much as I experienced, I suppose, the discrimination for class, I suppose, or
right.
or societal differences. I think for me that was more prevalent. I experienced that more, and as a result, I do have a little bit of a tendency. I guess I've improved a lot since then. But when I was schooling, especially, I had such an inferiority complex as a result of that. And it was funny because when you brought those things up, it's hard because especially in a country like Singapore, and don't get me wrong, like I love Singapore. It's a wonderful place for me, especially. But it's very hard to have our voices heard when we are discriminated against like this, because the acknowledgement is few and far between, and there isn't a space that people hold for that acknowledgement. So I think, in a way, as bad as the situation is in the US, there seems to be an outlet, regardless of whether you choose to accept that form of expression. Whereas in Singapore, I feel like there isn't that much of a space. But I don't know, it could just be me.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very valid point of view, that we maybe need to have more collective spaces, right? I mean, I think that's what maybe you're speaking about. That maybe how can we as a society, as a collective, acknowledge the acts of discrimination that have taken place, right? And it doesn't. The thing about acknowledgement is that you don't have to be the perpetrator to acknowledge it. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
That's why I think that. So we talk about this in trauma recovery as well. That part of trauma recovery, when someone comes to a therapist with a history of trauma, part of my work as a therapist is just to witness your experience. And that can be incredibly powerful, right? To have a non-judgmental, compassionate witness to experience is part, I would say, the foundation of the healing process, right? Even though I'm not the perpetrator, I had no part to take, in the event, but just being here and saying, yes, that happened and that shouldn't have happened is powerful, right? Just that simple act of acknowledging the injustice that exists, whether collectively, whether relationally, interpersonally. I think these are the small steps that we can take as individuals or as citizens, right? Even though we may not be able to go on the streets and protest here, but we can start that healing, I guess, in our small ways by being witnesses to people that we love, to our friends and our family, when they come to us and say, well, this happened and I'm hurt, whatever that event is. I think that's when we can be a compassionate witness. We start that chain of healing, and hopefully that chain of healing will spread, right, beyond ourselves. Yeah.
I like that term, compassionate witness. It's so true. We don't really have to solve any problems, but just to let someone express their anger and hurt. I think that's a beautiful segue to the question. One of the questions I have for you, and that is, if we have experienced a traumatic experience before, or if we do so in the future, how should we begin to, I suppose, in your words, acknowledge it, but then after that to deal with it as well?
So, first of all, I always go back to normalizing the traumatic stress response. And I think this is a good point for me to also just take a moment here to differentiate between PTS and PTSD, right? So
Okay.
post-traumatic stress without the D, right?
Yeah.
They often overlap in symptoms, but they're very different, right? So the PTS, post-traumatic stress, is common and normal and often adaptive when we are experiencing a traumatic or stressful event. Almost everyone who experiences a stressful, scary situation will show at least a few signs of PTS, and so some of the symptoms of PTS could be, just confusion or exhaustion or anxiety or numbness. And these are normal, right? But they will be self-limited. So they will all kind of like pass in time. They will all kind of fade away in time. And like I said before, most of us are incredibly resilient. And so the post-traumatic stress symptoms will naturally kind of fade away. However, with PTSD though, these are symptoms that don't go away, right? They are symptoms that are very, very intense, that impair your normal life functioning. Like you might not be able to eat or sleep or go to work, and they don't improve or subside on their own. So that's kind of a big difference when we talk about PTS versus PTSD. Okay, so for your question, I think first of all, I think I might have to kind of explain what happens a little bit to the brain when we are traumatized. Is that okay?
Of course. Yeah,
So
that's very interesting.
okay, so because if I don't explain that, it's kind of hard to kind of link it back to how then can we deal with it. Okay,
Yes,
so
got it.
yeah, so the first thing to recognize whether it's PTS or PTSD is that when we encounter a traumatic event, there will be what we call hyperarousal. Your nervous system is on high alert, and you might have heard of this. I'm sure you've heard of this phrase before, called the fight or flight response, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I always like to bring people back to National Geographic when I explain fight or flight response. It's one, sometimes I watch Nat Geo just to relax, but okay. So Nat Geo, right? One of the most typical scenes of that in any Nat Geo documentary, right, is kind of a prey versus a predator, right? Predator
Yep.
versus prey, right? So we've all seen the scene where like the deer is munching on grass with his buddies, right? And then out of the corner of its eye, the deer looks, to the left or whatever, and sees a lion or a lioness,
Right.
usually the lioness, right? Yeah. And so then you can see literally, right, in that moment, the deer goes to fight or flight. You can actually see that, right? That the deer becomes hyper vigilant, the deer pricks up its ears, its whole body becomes tense. And that's what happens to us as well. You're watching yourself, okay? You're watching yourself go into fight or flight, because in that moment, right, what happens in our brain is that this button, I call it the panic button. Like if you picture like this red flashing button in your brain, that's called the amygdala. So
Right.
the amygdala actually controls our fear response, and that switches on. Okay, so when we see a threat, whether it's a lioness or your house burning down or the COVID pandemic or somebody suspicious, lurking in the alleyway, your panic button goes on. Okay, so
Yep.
then your fight or flight kicks in, and the adrenaline and the cortisol, they rush to your limbs and give you additional energy. And that's what the deer does. The deer runs, right? Correct? So
Yep.
in that split second, the deer is actually calculating fight or flight. Can I fight this predator? Oh, he has stronger muscles than me and has big teeth. Cannot fight, right? That happens in like 2 seconds in the brain, And we do that as well. We calculate, can we fight this crisis? Oh, we can't fight this crisis, then we will run. We will flee, right?
Yeah.
So that's what's happening in the Nat Geo scene. The deer runs, and that's how most of us actually respond to danger. And that's the thing with human beings, of course. This also applies to real or imaginary danger. Yeah.
Right.
So, yeah. So whenever we get anxious in the middle of the night, we can't sleep, and we're thinking of all the things that might go wrong the next day. Literally, this is your biological response to your imaginary danger, right?
Right.
So what happens in PTS or PTSD is that the kind of the simplest way to explain it, right, is your amygdala is kind of stuck. Okay.
Yeah.
So your amygdala, your panic button hasn't been released. Even though the lion or the lioness isn't around anymore, the deer is still in fight or flight.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And so that's what they found happened with the returning veterans, right? Even though they were not at war anymore, they were still in fight or flight. So they had symptoms of hyperarousal. So some like I said, some symptoms of hyperarousal are like startle reactions. You get startled very easily, right? You can't sleep. You might respond strongly to changes in light or sound or touch. And so basically the nervous system is kind of like stuck at the moment of trauma. Does that make sense?
Right. Yes,
Yeah.
it does.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So because that's what happens in trauma, a lot of our work in the trauma field is to help to regulate the nervous system. Okay. So we're talking about really just basic emotional regulation. How do we teach the nervous system to calm down? Okay. So this is what I think we can all practice. This is why I think it's great that if you can go to a therapist, but if that's not accessible to you, I think the very basic skills of emotional regulation is available to everybody, And so one of the most important basic skills that is accessible is what we call the relaxation response. I don't know if you've heard of it, Nicholas.
I've not actually.
Okay. Yeah. So basically, what we do in the relaxation response is kind of like the fancy term for like relaxation, deep breathing, mindful elements of mindfulness as well, where we kind of like, okay, let's try to regulate the nervous system, right? Try to like bring it back to equilibrium, bring it back to calmness. Okay. So basically just really practicing deep breathing, for instance, right? The most beautiful thing about deep breathing is that you don't have to process any of your traumatic memory to be able to do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have learned in the trauma field as well is that sometimes the most effective intervention is not to process every single traumatic memory, because sometimes that can lead to re-traumatization, and we never want to re-traumatize the client. So the very first thing we do is to equip the person with self-regulation skills, part of which is the relaxation response, right? Can this person calm herself? Is this person able to self-soothe, right? So, so to be able to regulate your nervous system is a skill that everybody can practice, because you see, right, when you regulate your nervous system, when you are having deep breaths, you're taking deep breaths, you're actually regulating your heartbeat. You realize that, right?
Yes.
It's very hard to have a fast heartbeat with deep breathing. I don't know if you noticed that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I learned that during PE in school, because
really?
because they always say after you run, whatever your 2.4 or whatever, they're like, okay, now you just need to, inhale
breaths,
and exhale, so that you can kind of slow your heartbeat down. So that's the only reason why I know.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So deep breathing is like the very kind of like the very kind of basic but fundamental kind of, part of emotional regulation. But if you take deep breaths and your heart rate is slowed down, this actually affects how you feel as well. The anxiety will come down. The fight or flight response will naturally subside. The levels of adrenaline and cortisol will also naturally subside. And then you will feel overall calmer and more centered and more grounded, and that's what happens, in the relaxation response. Yeah.
Gotcha. It's funny when you were mentioning the National Geographic analogy. It struck a nerve because I actually and I suppose it's a story I want to share with you as well, Jolene, because I had the opportunity to go to the Serengeti in 2015, and I actually witnessed that that situation happen in real life. And it was like, it was a pack. It was actually a pack of lions or lioness
Wow.
trying to hunt. I think it was a wildebeest. I don't really know the names, to be honest, but it was that actually that witnessing that moment that it kind of helped me understand my own personal battle with mental health. And I'll tell you why. I know it seems very, very distant, that relationship, but
Mm-hmm.
because, I mean, I've always known about that fight or flight, and you could already sense that the wildebeest was noticing something was not right. And even though he realized that the predators were nearby and he started running, he just couldn't outrun five lions, right?
Of
and
course.
and at that moment I realized just how lucky I was to be you know a human being, where like, even though I was like struggling with depression and stuff like that, you know it wasn't just fight or flight that I had in my arsenal. I also had
Mm.
creativity, for ex- and
Absolutely.
and and the reason why I kind of made that correlation, I suppose, was because I also visited the Masai Mara tribe, and lions never attack their camp because the tribe have found ways to protect themselves against the lion or the predators. And that's what we have as humans. We have that kind of creativity to
Mm.
explore alternative ways to deal with the threat, and we don't
Mm.
always have to resort to the fight or flight, but we can also consider creative ways to prevent the thing altogether. So it was
No,
that
right.
it was that moment that kind of resonated with me, and realized, like, okay, life is not that bad. I can figure out ways to deal, and it's not always life or death. So
Yeah.
yeah, that kind of resonated with me,
Oh.
your analogy of Nat Geo.
Wow. Wow. Thanks for sharing that. That must have been really a powerful experience to witness that, right? In person. Yeah.
Yeah, it was. I
Ah.
mean, I reflected on it that evening. I mean, when I saw it, I was just like, "Wow, take picture, take picture." But
You were a tourist, right? Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
absolute tourist. Yeah. So, but then after that, I was
Mm.
like, "Huh." I think that's the asset we have as humans. To be able to problem solve and be creative, and
Mm.
so that should give us all hope, regardless of whatever we go through in life.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think absolutely it's kind of when the moment you realize that your old coping mechanism is not the only coping mechanism, right? Like the
Yeah.
fight or flight isn't the only option for you. There's a whole host of other options, and that's what makes us uniquely human. We are, the most innovative species, right? I think this is actually a really good kind of segue to what I wanted to elaborate on about. I mean, coincidentally, the moment you said creativity, and that I have this option of creativity, I really wanted to kind of also add here that when our amygdala is switched on, when the panic button is switched on, the neuroscientists and the brilliant neurobiologists that have been studying trauma for decades have shown that when we are afraid and in fight or flight, what happens is that our executive functioning switches off. Okay. So
Right.
the neural pathway in your brain, right, to what we call your prefrontal cortex. Your prefrontal cortex basically is like your CEO of the brain, right? It's like your executive functioning position. So your basically that's where your creativity and your innovation and your long-term thinking, your strategic thinking, your good decision making, all sits there, right? But we
Yeah.
can't access that if we are in fight or flight, right?
Right.
Because when amygdala switches on, prefrontal cortex switches off, right?
Yeah.
So that's why the relaxation response, when we are able to switch off the amygdala by using our breath, right, the deep breathing, then the prefrontal cortex can switch back on. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So that's why the neurobiology of it, there's the body and the mind are completely connected. The body and the mind are bi-directional. We have to remember that they are absolutely connected. So if we want to be creative and innovative and make good decisions, we have to learn how to calm our bodies. We have to learn how to self-soothe.
Wow.
because,
Okay.
right, that's the connection.
Got it.
Yeah, right? Because you think about it logically, if your house is on fire, right? At that moment, you're panicking. And I ask you, hey, what's your 5-year plan for your life? Can you answer me? No.
I can just
Right?
imagine, when
Right.
someone's
Right.
house is on
Right.
fire, a
Yeah.
journalist
Yeah.
just coming,
Yeah. Yeah.
what's your
What's,
5 year?
yeah. What do you think about the political landscape? What is your 5-year plan? I mean, those questions you know, take the prefrontal cortex to answer. That person will be like, "Are you nuts? I mean,
Yeah.
I need to go save my house." So that's why the two modes of operation cannot coexist.
Gotcha.
Yeah, yeah. So the first thing we need to do when someone feels traumatized or is in crisis or feels intense fear is to literally just help that person calm the nervous system down so that person can access that prefrontal cortex and that calmness and strategic thinking and that creativity that you're talking about.
Right.
Mhm.
So calming yourself down and self-soothing yourself is really pivotal in dealing and overcoming any sort of stressful experience.
Yep, that's right. That's right. You can't basically deal with the stressful experience if you are feeling so anxious or, to use a more common word, so triggered, right?
Right.
If you're in that space of fear or anxiety, you really can't think long term. You can't think calmly. So the very first step is to learn how to calm yourself.
Wow, that's
Mm.
awesome.
Mhm.
Well, I've learned a lot. I suppose my final question for you is, and you've mentioned it earlier, but I think maybe in the event you have other things as well. How can we support people who go through traumatic experiences? Especially
Mm.
if we don't have any professional background.
I would say by and large, the number one thing is to be that compassionate witness and to validate their experience. Because what we have found as therapists, I always ask this question when somebody comes to me with PTS or PTSD, and let's say they're talking about the traumatic event, and I mean, I'm always sitting respectfully and listening, but I also ask them, have you told anyone about this before you told me, right? Because do you know, that is such, I don't know if you know this, but that is a very important question,
Right.
because research has shown that the person or persons that they tell the traumatic event to right after the traumatic event, whether it's tomorrow or 1 year later, it doesn't matter, but that response of that person or persons actually can impact the survivor deeply, deeply, right?
Wow.
Yeah. So, for instance, I'll take a sexual assault example. Let's say a teen girl has been sexually assaulted and she keeps it to herself because she's ashamed, right? I mean, this is a very, unfortunately, a lot of survivors feel this shame and guilt.
Yeah.
Um, and for whatever reason, she keeps it to herself. And then finally, maybe a few months later, she tells an adult. She tells a counselor, a school counselor, or she tells her parent or an aunt. And the worst thing that can happen is that the adult invalidates the experience, right?
Right.
Right. The adult says, no, it couldn't have happened, right? That's invalidating. Or the worst thing the person can say is, you must have done something to ask for it.
Oh.
That puts so much guilt and shame to the survivor. And when I listen to these stories, my heart just breaks. And as therapists, we not only have to deal with the trauma of the original event, but we now have to deal with the secondary trauma of this invalidating experience, because that
Wow.
secondary trauma can be even more traumatizing than the first trauma in some cases.
Yeah.
Right? Because can you imagine, you finally decide to tell somebody, finally decide to tell somebody your deep secret that you haven't told anybody, and you're vulnerable, and this very person that you told it to says it's your fault. How can you emerge from that experience without feeling so unsafe in the world and, so vulnerable and so scared. Like, would you ever tell anybody else after that? Most of us won't, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think for us as friends or family or as a community, we have to be really mindful of that. When somebody comes to us and says, hey, something happened to me, something traumatic happened to me, you don't have to understand the specifics. You don't have to agree. You don't even have to give a solution. The most important thing is to acknowledge, to believe, and to validate, so that that person has the courage to heal from that experience. And your response is powerful, is important, right? If you have no words, right? Literally, some of us don't know what to say. That's fine. Just give the person a hug. Just say, I'm so sorry this happened to you. You don't have to use any fancy words, right? You don't have to, say anything specific. You just have to be a friend, to be that compassionate witness, because your response is so powerful, can have such a deep impact. Yeah.
Wow.
Mm.
That was very strong. I really felt that.
Mm.
It's so true, and I think if those are, I suppose, the big T events, right? And
Mm.
I suppose we should also be mindful of being compassionate to
Mm.
the small T's and to acknowledge
Yes,
that as well. And
definitely.
I
Mm.
think in hindsight, that has something that you know because I've experienced a big T when someone shares with me a small T, I've not been as empathetic as I should be. So this is a very, very important
Mm.
moment for me, at least, to acknowledge that, okay, I need to be more,
Yeah,
I need to acknowledge other people's small T's as well, because
yeah,
it's just
definitely.
as important.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And also to keep in mind, I think in line with what you said, that it actually, whether it's a big T or a small T, what is most important is how the person, the extent to which the person feels affected by the crisis. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
So for
I
some
do.
people, you know, the small T can actually be more impactful than the big T, right?
Yeah.
Because to us, oh my gosh, it's a big T, right? It's a huge thing. But we didn't know that actually the small T's affected our friend even more, right? So, for instance, again, to our examples. So, for some people, they're not so affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. They might not be, but they are more affected by their recent relationship breakup,
Right.
right? But who are we to say who is more important, right? We are not here to judge. We are just here to support and validate. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Mm. Mm.
acknowledge, support, and validate. Those are the
Mm-hmm.
three things you mentioned, right?
Mm, absolutely. Yeah.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a
Yeah.
great way to, I think, end off the podcast because I'm mindful of your time as well.
Mm.
Jolene, before we end it off, maybe you can also let us know or let the listeners know what you do and if they would like to get in touch, to find out more about your services or how you can help them. How can they reach you?
Yep. Well, I guess maybe yes, sure. Happy to. Sorry, I thought maybe I should have done this at the beginning of the
Oh
podcast.
no, because basically, I usually introduce the guest
Okay.
in a pre-recorded
Oh, so
part
you've done it
before.
already.
Yeah,
Okay. Okay.
but I think it's more authentic when it comes from the person when especially because I
Mm,
mean I'm always under the assumption that I would never do uh, as much justice as compared to when it comes from the person's mouth because
mm,
they are driven by their own purpose and motivation. So that's why I want to give you that time to really explain what you do and how you can help others and also how they can reach you.
Okay. Thanks so much, Nicholas. So I am a psychologist, and I've been practicing for about 10 years. And I originally studied in Chicago in the US, and then I came back and I was with KK Women's and Children's Hospital for a while before entering private practice. And in KK, I kind of specialize in women's health, especially postnatal depression, as well as I was also part of the adolescent medicine team where I saw a lot of teenagers. And then in private practice, I see a variety of presentations, including anxiety, depression, as well as PTSD. And I'm very passionate about the field of trauma work because I think that, as we've spoken about before, the roots of collective and intergenerational trauma are very deep, right? But we must first start addressing trauma on the individual level, and that's where the healing begins. And I'm always so grateful to be doing the work that I do because I understand that it's really an honor and a privilege to have clients trust me so wholeheartedly, to be a companion, really. I see myself as more of a companion and a facilitator in their healing journey. I don't see myself as an authority or an expert. I see myself just as a gentle facilitator because I really truly believe that where we have an innate ability to heal ourselves. We are all highly resilient people. And part of my work is really just to hold a space for my clients so that they can tap into the wisdom and resilience that already exists within them.
Gotcha.
All right.
And how can they
get in
touch?
Okay, I totally forgot about that.
That's the most important part, Jolene.
I'm not very good at marketing. Okay. So my website is claritycounselling.sg, and then you can reach me at Jolene at claritycounselling.sg. Yeah.
Perfect. I'll put the details in our podcast descriptions as well, so don't worry.
Okay, I'm not worried. Yeah. I'm like I said, I always forget that part.
Yeah, you're like, okay, yeah. So I helped these people. All right, thank you. You're like, okay, but how do we get in touch?
Yeah. That's the problem. That's the problem with most helping professionals, right? We are like, okay, let's do the work, let's do the helping, and then we're like, oh yeah, we forgot about the marketing communication part. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. well. Anyway, I also want to thank you for your time today. I really appreciate the conversation we've had. It was really fantastic, and perhaps if there's another interesting topic out there, I'd love to invite you back to discuss more.
Okay, yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me, Nicholas. It was definitely a pleasure, and keep in touch and have a good weekend.
Will do. Cheers,
all right,
Jolene.
Take care. Bye.